The first discordant glint was of sun off polished steel, where only the rough, familiar bark of the ancient park oak should have been. Captain Eva Rostova, her eyes usually scanning legal briefs or courtroom demeanors, felt a prickle of unease that tightened into a cold knot as she drew closer. Her father, Sergeant Major retired Alistair Rostova, was a man of unyielding routine, and his afternoon under that oak wheelchair, positioned just so for the dappled shade, was sacrosanct. But the wheelchair was not in its place. It lay on its side a few yards away, one wheel spinning, with a faint metallic whir, a crippled beetle in the otherwise serene landscape of Willow Creek's common green. Then she saw him, her father, not comfortably ensconced with his book, but positioned awkwardly at the base of the tree, his back pressed hard against the trunk, his face a mask of stony endurance that failed to entirely conceal the flicker of deep pain and an almost unbearable humiliation in his steely blue eyes. A heavy, brutally utilitarian chain was wrapped around his chest, cinching his arms tight against his sides, the other end secured with an industrial-sized padlock to a newly crudely installed eye-bolt drilled directly into the living wood of the majestic oak. He was quite literally chained to the tree. His legs, long ago rendered useless by an enemy's roadside bomb, were splayed unnaturally before him. A pristine laminated card, affixed with cold precision to the chain at Alistair's eye level, screamed its silent bureaucratic insult, property of Willow Creek Show. This area to be kept clear for aesthetic purposes. Unauthorized loitering and obstructions prohibited. Violators will be secured. Secured. The word in this context was an obscenity. Eva, a captain in the Army's Judge Advocate General's Corps, a woman who dealt daily with the complexities of justice misconduct and the rule of law, felt a surge of incandescent rage, so pure and potent it nearly buckled her knees. The central question exploding through her shock was not merely who could commit such a barbaric act, but what diseased definition of aesthetics could possibly justify the calculated public torture of a disabled war hero. Eva Rostova's existence was one of disciplined order, intellectual rigor, and an unshakable fealty to the principles of justice. Her uniform, with its sharply creased lines and insignia of rank, was more than attire. It was a commitment. As a JAG officer, she navigated the intricate channels of military law, prosecuted soldiers who betrayed their oaths, and defended those accused, always striving for fairness in a system designed for the stark realities of military life. Her father, Alistair, was the quiet, unwavering compass that had set her moral true north. A widower since Eva was a teenager, he was a man forged in the crucible of combat, a 30-year veteran whose body bore the permanent scars of his service, yet whose spirit remained indomitable. After a recent health scare had made it clear he needed to be closer to Eva, she had persuaded him to move from his remote country cottage to a small, accessible bungalow in Willow Creek. The sprawling, meticulously planned suburban community with its wide, smooth sidewalks, its lush green spaces, and its air of tranquil prosperity had seemed the perfect environment for his later years. Eva herself owned a townhouse nearby, allowing for easy visits and support. Alistair, despite his paraplegia and the chronic pain that was his constant companion, cherished his independence. His days were structured by simple self-imposed routines. Mornings were for reading the news, tending his small container garden on the patio, and corresponding with old Army buddies. Afternoons, weather permitting, were reserved for the oak tree. With his book, a thermos of tea, and often a small pair of binoculars to watch the birds, he would wheel himself to the edge of the community green, positioning his chair in the cool sanctuary of the oak's sprawling branches. It was his haven, his small daily pilgrimage to a place of peace. The first jarring notes in this carefully constructed harmony had been sounded predictably by Mrs. Karen Albright. As the president of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association, Mrs. Albright wielded her perceived authority with the zeal of a petty dictator. Her perfectly coiffed silver hair, her ramrod posture, and her voice which could drip with condescension or slice with icy disapproval were fixtures of the community. Anything or anyone that deviated from her rigid, narrow vision of suburban perfection became a target. Alistair, with his visible disability, his military-grade wheelchair, and his quiet daily occupation of her prized green space, had it seemed become such a target. The initial salvos were subtle, almost deniable microaggressions, usually directed at Ava during chance encounters. Captain Rostova Albright might begin her smile as brittle as spun glass. Your father's rather industrial-looking wheelchair. It does tend to leave rather conspicuous indentations on the common area turf, doesn't it? We do strive for a certain pristine quality here, or with a sigh that implied immense personal burden. Is it strictly necessary for him to frequent that particular oak tree for such extended durations? It does somewhat interrupt the natural vista, and we've had comments about maintaining an uncluttered visual sweep for all residents. Eva, always polite, but with an undercurrent of steel that Albright seemed incapable of perceiving, would patiently explain the Americans with Disabilities Act the concept of reasonable accommodation and the simple human right of a resident to enjoy the common amenities of his community. Albright would listen with a fixed, dismissive smile, her eyes cold and unyielding, making it clear that such mundane considerations as federal law or human decency were secondary to her aesthetic sensibilities. The inciting incident, the moment Karen Albright's passive aggression metastasized into active hostility, occurred approximately a month before the horrifying chaining. Alistair, as was his custom, was settled under the oak, engrossed in a history of the Roman legions. Eva, taking a rare mid-afternoon break from a complex court-martial brief, had planned to join him. She arrived to find Albright standing over her father clipboard, clutched to her chest like a breastplate, her voice sharp with accusation. Alistair's face was a study in controlled outrage. Albright was gesturing animatedly towards the small weatherproof canvas bag Alistair always kept attached to the armrest of his wheelchair. A bag containing his water bottle, a small emergency medical kit, his reading glasses, and his current book. This collection of personal detritus. Sergeant Rostova Albright was declaring her deliberate misuse of his rank. A calculated insult constitutes an unauthorized personal claim on HOA common property. Furthermore, your persistent daily occupation of this specific location is tantamount to loitering and is in clear violation of Bylaw 7, subsection D, regarding the monopolization of community visual assets. I must insist that you remove yourself and your effects immediately. Alistair, his voice low and gravelly but resonant with a lifetime of command, had fixed her with a stare that had once made colonels quail. Madam, he had stated each word precise. I am a dues-paying resident of this community. I am a veteran who defended the freedoms you so casually abuse. I am harming no one and nothing. I will sit where I damn well please under the provisions of common courtesy, and I might add federal law. Albright, momentarily taken aback by the unexpected ferocity of his response, had quickly recovered her composure. Her lips thinned into a bloodless line. We shall see about that, Sergeant. The HOA has very explicit rules regarding the aesthetic integrity and proper utilization of our shared spaces. You are in flagrant violation. Consider this your final warning. She had then spun on her heel, her back rigid with indignation, and marched away, leaving Alistair trembling slightly, not with fear, but with a profound visceral anger at the woman's unmitigated arrogance and disrespect. Eva, arriving in the wake of this confrontation, had felt her own anger flare. Dad, that woman is out of control. This is discriminatory harassment. I can file an injunction. Alistair, with a weary wave of his hand, had initially demurred. She's a puffed-up popinjay Ava girl, not worth the powder to blow her to perdition. I've faced down far worse than her bluster. But Ava, a seasoned prosecutor of misconduct, recognized the dangerous gleam in Albright's eye, the fanaticism of a petty tyrant. This was not mere bluster. It was a clear statement of escalating intent. The campaign of harassment intensified as Ava had grimly predicted. The first truly shocking incident, an act of deliberate targeted malice, involved the small foldable aluminum camp stool Alistair sometimes used beside his wheelchair as a makeshift table for his thermos or book. It was a modest, practical item easily stored. One afternoon, Alistair wheeled himself to his customary spot under the oak to find the stool gone. He assumed at first that perhaps children playing had moved it, or that the wind, though it was a still day, had somehow carried it off. He conducted a thorough search of the immediate area to no avail. Later that week, Eva, during a routine walk, happened to glance into one of the large, locked HOA refuse dumpsters awaiting collection. There, amidst bags of garden waste and discarded household items, she saw at Alistair's stool bent and twisted, clearly having been forcibly crushed. There was no direct proof linking Albright to the act, but the vindictive pettiness of it bore her unmistakable signature. It was a clear message. Alistair's small comforts, his attempts to make his outdoor refuge more accommodating, would not be tolerated. Shortly thereafter, a new professionally printed metal sign was bolted to a post, directly in front of Alistair's preferred spot beneath the oak. In crisp, authoritative lettering, it proclaimed, "Designated scenic area. No lingering loitering or personal items. Keep clear at all times. By order of HOA management." It was a public, deliberate act of bullying designed to shame and displace her father, to erase his presence from Karen Albright's sanitized vision of Willow Creek. The second major incident was a more formal, coercive maneuver, leveraging the bureaucratic power of the HOA. Ava received a thick envelope via certified mail. Inside was an official HOA violation notice, replete with date-stamped photographs of her father's wheelchair parked under the oak tree. The notice cited several newly invented or creatively interpreted bylaws, including unauthorized and prolonged monopolization of common area visual resources, creation of an unaesthetic and obstructive visual impediment, and non-compliant deployment of personal mobility apparatus in a designated scenic zone. The document signed with a flourish by Karen Albright. President demanded that Alistair immediately cease and desist his offending activity and remove his obstructive presence from the area, or face escalating daily fines, suspension of community privileges, and further disciplinary actions as deemed appropriate by the board. The sheer effrontery, the transparently discriminatory nature of the charges, left Eva momentarily speechless. Then her legal training kicked in. With cold precision, she drafted a comprehensive and blistering response. She cited the Fair Housing Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, relevant state anti-discrimination statutes, and detailed Karen Albright's escalating pattern of targeted harassment against an elderly disabled veteran. She refuted each bogus charge, highlighted the HOA's legal obligations to provide reasonable accommodation, and threatened immediate and substantial legal action, including a federal civil rights lawsuit and a formal complaint to the Department of Housing and Urban Development, if the harassment and discriminatory actions did not cease forthwith. She hand-delivered the letter to Karen Albright's meticulously kept doorstep, placing it directly into her hand. Albright had merely glanced at the official letterhead, her lips curving into a cold, smug smile. "Lawyers and their fancy words don't intimidate me, Captain Rostova," she had hissed, her eyes like chips of ice. "In Willow Creek, our covenants and our community's aesthetic standards are paramount. Your father is the one in violation, not the HOA." The woman's unshakable, fanatical conviction in her own petty tyranny had sent a genuine chill down Eva's spine. She had clearly underestimated not just Albright's vindictiveness, but her apparent belief that she operated above the law. She had not, however, anticipated that Albright's next move would involve actual physical chains. Now kneeling beside her tethered father, the acrid scent of his fear and her own fury thick in the air, Eva's mind, honed by years of military justice, began to systematically dissect the situation. "Dad," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, despite the tremor in her hands, as she examined the cold steel biting into the fabric of his jacket. "Are you injured? Can you feel your legs? Any unusual pressure?" He met her gaze, his own eyes bleak, but with a spark of the old warrior's fire. "The usual nothing below the waist, Eva girl, but my shoulders, my chest. This damn chain is cinched so tight it's hard to breathe properly, and the indignity of it lasts, the bloody calculated indignity, to be trussed up like a stray dog." His voice, normally a resonant baritone, was hoarse, with a mixture of pain and outrage. Eva's fingers, professionally detached, explored the heavy-gauge chain, the robust brand-new padlock. This wasn't a crime of passion or a spontaneous act of petty vandalism. This was premeditated. This required the deliberate purchase of specific materials, a conscious, cold-blooded decision to inflict this particular form of restraint and humiliation. She pulled out her secure military-issued smartphone, its encrypted systems a stark contrast to the primitive brutality before her. Her first call was to 911, her voice crisp and devoid of emotion, as she reported an aggravated assault and unlawful imprisonment of a disabled elderly male, requesting immediate police and paramedic assistance, giving the precise location of the Willow Creek Common Green. Her second call, navigating through the automated system with practiced impatience, was to the non-emergency line of the local police precinct. She asked to be put through directly to Detective Miller, a seasoned, no-nonsense officer, with whom she had briefly liaised on a minor interagency jurisdictional matter some months prior. "Detective Miller," she said, when his familiar gravelly voice came on the line, "it's Captain Eva Rostova, U.S. Army JAG Corps. I am at the Willow Creek Community Common Green. My father, Sergeant Major Alistair Rostova, retired a paraplegic combat veteran, has been the victim of a serious assault and what appears to be an illegal detainment. He has been physically chained to a tree. The prime suspect is the president of our Homeowners Association, a Mrs. Karen Albright. I am requesting a full crime scene unit and your personal attendance. This is not, I repeat, not a simple neighborhood dispute. This is a felony, quite possibly multiple felonies, and given my father's status, there may also be specific veteran protection statutes in play." There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end, then Miller's voice sharp with professional concern. "Understood, Captain. I'm on my way." The piercing wail of approaching sirens ripped through the tranquil afternoon quiet of Willow Creek, drawing curious residents from their homes. Windows opened, doors creaked, and soon a small crowd of onlookers began to gather at a respectful distance, their expressions morphing from mild curiosity to shock, and then to outright horror as the scene at the old oak tree came into focus. The paramedics were first to arrive, their calm, professional demeanor a stark contrast to the ugly reality of Alistair's predicament. They immediately began assessing his condition, their faces grim as they noted the tightness of the chain, the way it constricted his chest, and the awkward, strained position of his body. Police cruisers followed their flashing lights, casting an incongruous, lurid glow on the sun-dappled green. Officers began to secure the area, establishing a perimeter with yellow crime scene tape, their movements efficient and purposeful. Detective Miller arrived shortly thereafter, his expression hardening as he took in the sight of Alistair, the heavy chain, the damning laminated HOA notice still affixed to it. Eva, maintaining a remarkable, almost preternatural composure, provided Miller with a concise, chronological, and legally precise account of Karen Albright's escalating campaign of harassment, culminating in this barbaric act. She presented him with physical copies of the threatening HOA violation notice, her detailed legal response to it, and a photograph of Alistair's deliberately destroyed aluminum stool. While the paramedics, with considerable difficulty and the eventual use of heavy-duty hydraulic bolt cutters, worked to free Alistair from his bonds, a task made more perilous by the need to avoid causing further injury to his already compromised body. Eva's legal mind was racing, cataloging the potential charges. Assault with a deadly weapon, the chain used in such a manner, battery, false imprisonment, unlawful restraint, willful endangerment of a vulnerable adult, an elderly and disabled individual. And given her father's distinguished military service and his current status as a disabled veteran, there were almost certainly specific state and federal statutes concerning cruelty to or abuse of veterans that would apply carrying enhanced penalties. She watched her fists clenched as the last link of the chain finally sprang apart and her father sagged forward, supported by the paramedics. His face was ashen, his breathing shallow and ragged. He was carefully transferred to a waiting gurney. I'm all right, Eva girl," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper, but his eyes, when they met hers, were filled with a pain that went far deeper than any physical injury. "Just get me out of this damned three-ring circus." As he was being gently wheeled towards the waiting ambulance, Eva saw her. Karen Albright, emerging from her impeccably maintained house, directly across the green, a look of what could only be described as smug, righteous satisfaction on her face as she surveyed the commotion, the police cars, the ambulance, her hand resting lightly on her perfectly coiffed hair. That single, fleeting expression of triumph ignited a fresh inferno of controlled rage in Eva. This woman felt no remorse, no shame, only a perverse sense of vindication. Eva, her jaw set, her eyes like chips of Arctic ice, approached Albright Detective Miller, moving to flank her. Mrs. Albright, Eva said, her voice low, lethally calm, resonating with the full weight of her military authority. My father is currently being transported to the hospital as a direct result of your criminal actions. Actions which I assure you constitute multiple serious felony offenses under both state and federal law. Albright's composure wavered, just for a nanosecond, a flicker of something, surprise fear, in her cold eyes, before her habitual mask of arrogant condescension snapped back into place. Captain Rostova, she began, her voice dripping with false sympathy. I am, of course, dreadfully sorry if your father experienced any discomfort. However, I assure you, I was merely acting in my official capacity as HOA president, enforcing duly enacted community regulations. Your father regrettably was creating an unsightly and unauthorized obstruction in a designated aesthetic zone. The area needed to be secured for routine landscape maintenance. It is all perfectly within the HOA's purview and guidelines, as outlined in the covenants you agreed to when you purchased property in Willow Creek. Her audacity, her barefaced attempt to normalize this barbarity with bureaucratic jargon, was breathtaking. Securing a disabled war hero to a tree with a padlocked chain, Mrs. Albright, Detective Miller interjected, his voice like granite is not within HOA guidelines. It is a violent crime. We will require you to accompany us to the station to answer some rather pointed questions regarding your interpretation of aesthetic maintenance. Alistair was admitted to the hospital for observation. Physically apart from severe contusions and deep bruising across his chest and shoulders where the chain had bitten into his flesh and strained ligaments from the awkward prolonged positioning, he was miraculously, relatively unscathed. The psychological toll, however, was far more profound. The public humiliation, the utter helplessness, the feeling of being treated not as a decorated veteran, a respected elder, or even a human being, but as an inanimate object, an unsightly obstruction to be secured. It had struck a devastating blow to the core of his hard-won dignity and his stoic resilience. Ava stayed with him for hours long, after he had drifted into an uneasy painkiller-induced sleep, her heart aching with a mixture of sorrow for his suffering and a burning, righteous anger. Then, leaving him in the capable hands of the nursing staff, she drove to the precinct, not just as a grieving and outraged daughter, but as Captain Eva Rostova, an officer of the court, an instrument of military justice, now determined to bring the full weight of civilian law down upon Karen Albright. She spent over 2 hours with Detective Miller and a newly assigned assistant district attorney, meticulously detailing the entire history of Albright's escalating harassment, providing copies of all correspondence photographs and contact information for potential witnesses, neighbors who had undoubtedly seen Albright's previous interactions with Alistair, or had perhaps been victims of her HOA tyranny themselves. She also began her own discreet, off-the-books inquiries. Leveraging her access to public record databases and online community forums through secure channels, she started to build a deeper profile of Karen Albright and the operational methods of the Willow Creek HOA under her presidency. What she began to uncover was the chilling midpoint twist, a distinct demonstrable pattern of targeted abuse of power that extended far beyond her father's case. Albright, it appeared, had a documented history of vindictively targeting any resident she perceived as a challenge to her absolute authority or a blight on her warped aesthetic ideals. Elderly residents who were too slow or whose medical equipment was unsightly, families with young children whose play was too noisy, or disruptive individuals with disabilities whose necessary accommodations were deemed architecturally discordant. There were numerous anonymous and some not so anonymous complaints and allegations online detailing similar acts of intimidation, selective enforcement of rules, destruction of personal property disguised as maintenance, and the punitive leveraging of HOA fines and liens to settle personal vendettas or to drive out residents she disliked. This wasn't just an isolated incident of cruelty towards her father. It was indicative of a systemic reign of terror, a pattern of conduct that screamed of sociopathic narcissism and a dangerous abuse of power. The most crucial, irrefutable piece of evidence, however, came from an entirely unexpected source. Later that evening, a visibly nervous young man, a teenager who lived a few doors down from Eva, approached Detective Miller at the still-secured crime scene on the common green. He clutched his smartphone in a sweaty hand. "Detective," he stammered, "I think I might have something you need to see. I was, practicing some skateboard tricks over there." He gestured vaguely, and I saw Mrs. Albright yelling at the old soldier. She was really mad. So I just kind of like hit record on my phone, just in case. The video footage, though short and filmed from a distance, the angle partially obscured by a decorative shrub, was damning. It captured Karen Albright, her face contorted in a mask of cold fury, brandishing the thick chain and the heavy padlock. Her voice, sharp and venomous, was clearly audible over the ambient neighborhood sounds. "You've been warned, old man. This is an HOA designated beautification zone. If you won't respect our community's rules and our aesthetic standards, then I will make you respect them." Then the video showed her advancing on Alistair, who was seated in his wheelchair and with a shocking degree of brutal efficiency, forcibly wrapping the chain around his chest and then around the trunk of the oak tree, her movements quick, practiced, and utterly devoid of hesitation or remorse. It was the smoking gun, the incontrovertible proof of premeditation and malice. The climax of this suburban horror story arrived not in a courtroom, at least not initially, but at an emergency HOA board meeting convened the following evening in the Willow Creek Community Clubhouse. The meeting had been called by several horrified and now deeply alarmed board members, but Karen Albright, with breathtaking arrogance and a complete lack of self-awareness, had insisted on presiding over it herself, ostensibly to address the unfortunate and widely misinterpreted incident of yesterday, and to reaffirm the HOA's unwavering commitment to maintaining community standards and property values. The clubhouse was packed to capacity, the air thick with a palpable mixture of tension, outrage, and a kind of fearful anticipation. Ava was there, seated in the front row, not in her military uniform, but her very posture, her calm, watchful demeanor, radiated an unmistakable aura of quiet, formidable authority. Albright, looking remarkably composed, even defiant, opened the meeting with a lengthy, self-aggrandizing monologue about the often thankless burdens of leadership, the difficult decisions required to protect the greater good of the community, and the unfortunate necessity of occasionally taking firm, decisive action against those few individuals who refuse to abide by mutually agreed-upon covenants for the sake of collective aesthetic harmony. She painted Alistair as a stubborn, uncooperative elderly man who had repeatedly flouted reasonable requests and deliberately created an ongoing visual nuisance, and herself as a long-suffering patient enforcer of rules who had been left with no other option but to temporarily secure the area to prevent further violations. When she finally grudgingly opened the floor to comments from residents, Eva Rostova rose slowly to her feet. A hush fell over the crowded room. Her voice when she spoke was not loud, but it was clear, precise, and resonated with an icy, controlled anger that was far more intimidating than any shout. "Mrs. Albright," she began, her gaze unwavering, "you speak of rules, of covenants, of aesthetics. Allow me to speak of the law. Your actions yesterday against my father, Sergeant Major Alistair Rostova, a decorated combat veteran, a Purple Heart recipient, and a paraplegic senior citizen, were not an enforcement of any legitimate community standard. They were a series of premeditated criminal acts. Specifically, they constituted felony assault with a dangerous instrument, aggravated battery upon a vulnerable elderly person, unlawful imprisonment, and reckless endangerment. Furthermore, given my father's protected status as a disabled veteran, your actions also fall squarely under the purview of U.S. Code, Title 18, Section 1389, concerning the willful injury, abuse, or endangerment of a veteran, a federal offense which carries significant penalties, including imprisonment." Albright, her face beginning to flush, a dangerous shade of crimson, attempted to interrupt, to bluster, but Eva held up a hand, a gesture of such quiet, steely authority that Albright actually faltered. "You also, Mrs. Albright," Eva continued, her voice dropping slightly, taking on the precise, incisive tone she used in cross-examinations, appear to have engaged in a persistent and documented pattern of discriminatory harassment based on disability in clear violation of the Fair Housing Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act. And that Mrs. Albright opens both you personally and this homeowners association collectively to substantial civil liability. Albright finally found her voice a shrill, panicked screech. "This is a private residential community, Captain Rostova. We have our own democratically established covenants and bylaws. Your military justice codes and your far-fetched accusations have no bearing here. This is an internal HOA matter. Perhaps my military codes do not directly apply here, Mrs. Albright, Eva conceded with a chillingly calm smile. But I assure you, the criminal and civil laws of this state, and of the United States of America, most certainly do. And as for evidence of your specific actions yesterday, she paused, her gaze sweeping the room, then nodded almost imperceptibly towards the main entrance of the clubhouse. As if on cue, the doors opened and Detective Miller entered, flanked by two uniformed police officers. The collective gasp from the assembled residents was audible. Miller walked directly to the head table where Karen Albright sat, now visibly trembling, her arrogant composure finally shattering. Karen Albright. Detective Miller stated, his voice devoid of inflection based on eyewitness testimony, victim statements, photographic and video evidence. The Willow Creek Police Department has determined there is more than sufficient probable cause to arrest you for the multiple felony offenses previously outlined by Captain Rostova. He then turned to address the stunned and silent assembly. In addition, Mrs. Albright, it has come to our attention through numerous credible sources, including Captain Rostova's preliminary investigation, that you may have engaged in a systemic pattern of abuse of your HOA authority, possibly constituting additional charges of extortion, fraud, and conspiracy. A wider investigation into the financial and operational practices of this HOA under your leadership will be commencing immediately. He then turned back to the now ashen-faced Albright. You are under arrest, ma'am, he stated, as one of the uniformed officers moved behind her and the sharp metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the suddenly silent clubhouse. Karen Albright's reign of suburban terror was definitively over. Her protests, which began as sputtering denials and quickly escalated into incoherent shrieks about her rights about disrespectful residents and about the persecution of dedicated community volunteers, were ignored as she was firmly but professionally escorted from the premises. In the weeks and months that followed, the full sordid extent of Karen Albright's abuses of power and her vindictive cruelty came to light. Numerous current and former residents of Willow Creek, emboldened by her arrest, and the clear demonstration that she was not, in fact, above the law, came forward with their own meticulously documented stories of her intimidation tactics, her selective enforcement of rules for personal vendettas, her financial improprieties, and her outright harassment of anyone who dared to question her authority. The Homeowners Association Board was immediately dissolved by a vote of no confidence from the shell-shocked residents. An interim committee, which included Eva Rostova, serving as a pro bono legal advisor, was quickly formed. Their first task was to initiate a complete forensic audit of the HOA's finances and to begin the arduous process of rewriting the community's covenants and bylaws to ensure such tyrannical abuses could never happen again, embedding principles of transparency, accountability, due process, and explicit protections for vulnerable residents. Karen Albright faced a formidable array of criminal charges. Ava, working closely with a dedicated assistant district attorney who specialized in elder abuse and hate crimes, provided expert consultation on the specific veteran cruelty statutes and the nuances of prosecuting crimes against individuals with disabilities. The video evidence of the chaining incident was irrefutable. Combined with Alistair's powerful and dignified victim impact statement and the corroborating testimony of other residents whom Albright had terrorized the prosecution, built an unassailable case. Albright was found guilty on multiple felony counts, including aggravated assault, false imprisonment, and a rarely prosecuted but fitting charge of intentional abuse of a vulnerable veteran. The judge, in sentencing her to a lengthy prison term, delivered a scathing rebuke of her callous disregard for basic human dignity and her monstrous perversion of community leadership into an instrument of personal tyranny. In addition to her incarceration, Albright was stripped of all personal assets through a series of successful civil lawsuits, including a substantial 7-figure judgment awarded to Alistair Rostova for his pain suffering and the egregious violation of his civil rights. The funds were placed into a trust, which Alistair promptly arranged to have primarily benefit disabled veterans' charities. Alistair's recovery was a slow and challenging journey. The physical bruises and strains eventually faded, but the emotional and psychological scars, the deep wounds to his pride and his sense of security lingered. For a long time, he avoided the common green, the old oak tree now a painful reminder of his humiliation. He became quieter, more withdrawn, the spark in his eyes dimmed. But the transformation of Willow Creek itself played a crucial role in his healing. Under new, compassionate, and genuinely democratic leadership, the community began to breathe again. Neighbors, many of whom confessed their shame and regret for their previous silence in the face of Albright's bullying, reached out to Alistair with acts of kindness, respect, and genuine contrition. They organized working bees to beautify the common green, not according to some rigid aesthetic code, but with an emphasis on accessibility and shared enjoyment. A group of local veterans hearing of his ordeal arranged a small, deeply moving ceremony at the old oak tree. They installed a simple, dignified bronze plaque at its base, not a memorial, but a tribute, honoring Sergeant Major Alistair Rostova's decades of selfless service to his country and his quiet courage in the face of adversity. They then, with Alistair's hesitant permission, built a small, accessible paved patio area around the tree, complete with a comfortable shaded bench dedicated in his name. Ava watched, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and relief as her father, his eyes suspiciously bright, accepted these tributes, shaking hands, even sharing a few quiet words with his fellow servicemen. Slowly, tentatively, he began to resume his afternoon ritual. He would wheel himself to the new patio, his new sturdier all-terrain wheelchair, a gift from a grateful community, positioned proudly in the shade of the ancient oak. He read his books, watched the birds, and gradually, the lines of pain around his eyes softened, replaced by a quiet, resilient peace. Ava continued her demanding work in the JAG Corps, her commitment to justice and the rule of law, not just affirmed, but deepened by her intensely personal battle against a different kind of enemy on the home front. The fight had been ugly, painful, and infuriating, but seeing her father reclaim his dignity, witnessing an entire community rediscover its humanity and its compassion, was its own profound and lasting victory. The law, she knew, with an even greater certainty, was not merely an abstract set of statutes and codes, but a living, breathing shield for the vulnerable, a potent weapon against tyranny in all its forms, whether on a battlefield or in a suburban enclave. And the rustle of leaves in the old oak tree, once a sound Alistair had associated with peace and then with profound violation, now seemed to whisper a new song, a melody of respect, resilience, community, and hard-won, enduring tranquility.